So it is recording now.
Good. But I should be seeing a lot of people.
Okay, should I let people in?
Do. Yes, please do.
Okay, I do that now.
Yeah, I can see the waiting room and everybody else. All
Okay.
right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. We have Esther Huang and Peter Papesh as the co-chairs of the Sustainability Education Committee of the Boston Society of Architects. And we are going to share our responsibilities a little bit. I will make the presentation about the R word, and actually I've augmented it also to include the protect word. And we'll get into that in a moment. And I just wanted to alert you and everybody that your continuing education credits can be found in a link in the chat room that Esther has set up for you. I see a new face. Esther, I haven't met you, but I gather you're my classmate's daughter, I assume. No, she can't hear me. Well, she can hear me, but I can't hear her. Okay. Lots of other people. Welcome all, for sure. And now let me do a disclaimer. I'm old and I have senior moments, so I ask you to bear with me while I grope for words. Don't get distracted by that. Listen to the message as a whole. I hope it'll be interesting. So here's to the topic.
You're muted. We can't hear you.
How to stop buffering issues anywhere, anytime, instantly. Internet providers don't want you to know about this.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, yes, that's better.
Okay, good. All right. This will be the link. To this presentation that I mentioned, that I gave a couple of years ago to TEDx Youth Beacon Street. Hello. I'm here to talk about engaging disaster elegantly. Engaging means learning to understand. Disaster refers to climate change and global warming induced sea level rise and storm surges. And elegantly refers to wisdom and compassion. Imagine that you are a teenager in a family living in a very comfortable neighborhood, and unbeknownst to you, some family who is basically unfriendly moves in next door and they have a vicious dog. This dog is loosely leashed to a small peg and occasionally tears loose and terrorizes the entire neighborhood. You, with your good heart and your good head, become a sort of counselor for your family as it addresses this looming disaster. Ignoring the disaster is not an option. Escaping from it or protecting yourself from it is not much of an option either. So you decide collectively to consider retreating from this looming disaster, from moving. And you, with your good heart and your good head, have a very important role to play to advise while the entire family is mired in indecision and worry. Where are we going to move? How are we going to move? When? And most importantly, you will help them confront the impending sadness of having to cut ties and roots and moving on. This is probably going to be your most important role as you become a counselor to your family. Henceforth, and for the rest of your lives, any mention of the disaster of storm surge and sea level rise will bring that mad dog image to your mind. This will be true for the rest of your lives. Talking about sea level rise and disasters, we've already had 2 of those this year in Boston, one in January and one in March. Storm surges, like mad dogs, are very difficult to defend against. Eventually you'll be asked, because of your good experience in helping your family move and retreat from looming disaster, you'll be asked to help a small community that lives on the shoreline and is threatened by sea level rise to discuss the issues and help them decide to perhaps move and retreat. You will reach for information, such as this information about what it will look like in 2030 or 2050 when there is a 2-foot sea level rise and a 5-foot storm surge. This map by Sasaki explains how the areas in blue will indicate where storm surges will flood local communities in Winthrop, in Revere, in East Boston, near the airport, in Charlestown, and most importantly, most of Cambridge and most of Boston. You will make this even more dramatic with this view from the Prudential Tower looking north, where a similar storm surge and flooding inundates the Back Bay residential area in Boston and MIT and large parts of Cambridge further afield in the north. You will zoom out to explain where we are by taking this image of the Metro Boston estuary. It shows an estuary, and in this case, our estuary, shows where our Mystic River and Charles River and Neponset River empty out into the ocean. Our Metro estuary is unique in some respects because in the north, in Swampscott, it has shoulder area, a high area, and again, in the south, in Cohasset, it has a shoulder area. These two are shown in the bottom right corners of this image. And you'll zoom out further to explain how Boston is the hub of the economic engine of Greater Boston. 422 billion in annual GDP in 1916. People who make this engine work commute from New Hampshire in the north, from midway through Massachusetts in the west, and from Rhode Island in the south to make this engine function. If
Peter,
both
we're not seeing any video.
it doesn't work well, the economic engine is in jeopardy. Let me hang on a second. You're not seeing the video?
We are
We're
all
only
seeing a
seeing your
TEDx
desktop.
desktop.
I don't see a TEDx talk. I just see a TEDx title screen, and I think that's the case for others.
Do you have two screens, Peter? Is it on your other monitor?
How about this? Can you see the presentation before I zoomed, before I enlarged to full screen? Can you see this now?
It's not full screen.
No, it's not full screen, but at least can you see it? That'll enable you to hear the
You see
presentation.
the Ideas in Action TEDx screen, your desktop, the other monitors you could see.
YouTube?
Yes,
Okay, look, let me go back. How far back have you not been able to follow this presentation?
We can only see up to 11 seconds. So the screen that we see, it's paused at 11 seconds.
Okay. You will read. I'm going to go over and see whether this works,
We could hear everything fine, though.
but not see anything more than this.
No. Yeah, just a title screen.
Then let me go back to where we were. At least you can hear what I meant to say. I'll review a little bit of that in the presentation later on anyway, okay? I'm sorry about this. I'm a Luddite, and I thought I had found a way to introduce this video to the presentation today. I gather I haven't. Make sure that you can hear us, at least. But unlike these Oregon pioneers who went into the wilderness pretty much unprepared, you will remind us that we will migrate with knowledge and understanding. And you will encourage us to do it under the banner of dirt. Do it right this time. You'll show us what doing it wrong can look like. You will ask us to learn from nature. Nature has an amazing palette of examples of how to do it right. Most particularly, its root systems, which are the distribution systems for its nutrients and its information between plants of different species. And you will emphasize how that root system is intricately interlaced with other roots, and that is what makes nature's systems both robust and work well. You will contrast this to our man-made infrastructure systems, such as highway intersections, railway lines, power lines, pipelines under our streets. And you will encourage us as we contemplate creating new homes and new communities to interlace and interweave our infrastructure system with that of nature, thereby making both more robust. Most importantly, you will search out like-minded individuals in our small pioneering group who look at the looming disaster of sea level rise soberly, help us overcome as we mill around mired in indecision and worries about how to do it, where to do it, and most importantly, how to learn to cut our ties and roots and establish new ones elsewhere, that collectively is where you will provide the most service to the new pioneers. You reach for an example like this that interlaces and interweaves strands of different color and sometimes superimposes them and still becomes a weave that some people find beautiful. You will reach for whimsical examples and ask us to become creative in what we reach for, such as tree houses, even though they don't have much infrastructure that could make this thing work. And you will ask us to look at examples like the self-contained and self-sufficient termite mound on the left, which is totally air-conditioned and exists within its own bioregion for its food production, or instead, or also in addition, reach for this aluminum cast of an anthill to once again show that complexity and intricacy can be beautiful. In this manner, you will help us modern pioneers move on to be resilient, self-supporting, and devoted to doing it right as we engage disaster elegantly.
Did I hear that speech?
Hi, everybody. I am very sorry about this glitch. We had tested it. It seemed to have worked, but now it doesn't. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so here's the presentation. I have already shown you this image during the TEDx talk of our Metro Boston estuary, the Boston estuary per se, between Swampscott in the right-hand bottom corner and Cohasset. Three of us decided to make a proposal to link these two shoulder areas with a protective seawall. First of all,
Are you sharing a screen right now?
yes.
I don't see
I only
it.
see black.
I still see the TEDx.
Yeah, I still see the TEDx too.
You should stop sharing, start sharing again,
And start
and
sharing
make
again.
sure you're picking the right screen when you start sharing.
Oh,
There we
There.
go.
Now we can see it.
I can see it.
We can see the map.
okay. It's a team effort here now. Thanks a lot. All right. This image from Sasaki, this is from Climate Central, shows the most valuable properties that would be affected with a 5-foot sea level rise. You can get to this information and really peruse it. It has tremendous amount of information. So three of us, Franziska Amaker, Vernon Woodworth, and I proposed a 14-mile-long barrier shown in green to protect all of Greater Boston and all the adjacent communities. This would have to be built down to a level of 150 feet below sea level. Here is a topographic map of the sea level floor. And the idea would essentially be the following: to create a dike 14 miles long with facilities to have wind power, solar power, even residential development. And behind it, if properly constructed, could be a brackish lake initially, and eventually primarily a freshwater lake that would be protected by this dike. Now, I'm going to simply point you, and you will be able to see this in the rerun of this presentation, to this YouTube to explain how sand dikes fail. It's just like we were taught to show and to understand what happens when you take a bucket of sand and it's dry and you go and put a brick on top of it and the brick is nice and solidly placed on top of the sand. You pour water into it and the brick sinks. Well, this is a geological phenomenon, so that when water separates individual grains of sand, the whole thing collapses. This illustration is wonderful, worthwhile seeing. Now, there is a way around that to create a dike that will not do that, and that's called Roman concrete. Again, on the left-hand side, you will find the link to this article. It's a recent article, but this picture comes from a long time ago already, where somebody else explained what Roman concrete really is. It's the combination of volcanic ash and seawater, the salt water, which makes for an incredibly strong concrete that had been forgotten how to be produced since Roman times. The concrete that was developed in the 18th or 19th century in England, called Portland cement, is a combination of burning chalk and clay and in the process releasing a tremendous amount of CO2, which is why concrete is such a detrimental material for architects to use. Back to the concept of the value of creating a 14-mile long dam. This illustration here is a little bit complex, but bear with me. Value is shown on the orthogonal, and time is shown in the horizontal. The bottom line says resilient preparation costs. In other words, creating a 14-mile long dam costs a hell of a lot and gets less and less expensive in terms of value over time. The top line, in the middle, you see rising water versus value decrease. Somewhere there's an intersection, but the point being, value presentation increases as rising waters, sea waters rise, and as value decreases, or theoretically decreases, but if it's protected, it increases quite substantially. So from our start of 420 billion GDP currently, or back in 2016, you can imagine how much this will increase over time. So this is an important diagram. Thanks to two professors from the Harvard Business School, one of them being George Maycomber's son. As I said, it's worth to consider the investment of 30 to 80 billion in such a dike, 14-mile long dike, to protect $80 billion of Boston properties alone, plus an economic output of 420 billion in 2016 dollars. Let me explain. Gesundheit, by the way. Richard, you need to mute yourself.
Yeah, sorry.
We're amongst friends. Here is a map illustrating the extent of the Boston economic engine. It reaches from New Hampshire to mid-Massachusetts down to Providence and Fall River in the south. It's enormous. People from the extreme parts of this catchment area travel to Boston to make Boston produce the 420 billion and they travel back home. So there's a constant back and forth. Think about what will happen as the climate change map would show with a 5-foot sea level rise. On the left-hand side of this image is an illustration in blue of the flooded areas in the greater metropolitan Boston area. On the right-hand side, I took this and inverted all the blue areas to show what would happen essentially to be flooded from seawater. So the sea on the right-hand side will also flood large parts of Boston. And you can see in the next slide, the fragmentation, the geographic fragmentation, which will be absolutely ruinous for Boston and the adjacent communities, the affected communities, whose organizations and populations will have to decide to move. The economic engine would definitely be demolished, essentially. That's my prediction, layman that I am, but I think it is clear why that would happen. So think about this enormous danger, which we cannot realistically defend against. And think about, if we don't defend against it, relocating. Our forebears did that on the Oregon Trail. They produced new communities like this, but you can see it's a ramshackle and haphazard thing. And we, with knowledge of where we're heading, or we would be heading, and knowledge of what it is that we are looking at, we could do it right. Do it right this time. That's the name of a Canadian company that produces office furniture. But their motto is dirt. And I think it's a very apt motto for us to keep in mind. Back to the image of the natural system of information and communication, the infrastructure of human infrastructure of different types, which you saw, maybe some of you saw in the TEDx talk. Here are reminders of what we could emulate. The four of us, the three of us that talked about the regional implications of a 14-mile long dam are the following. It needs a metropolitan government. Some organization that can coordinate the following three major components. Protect plus create, namely create that sea barrier, the sea change that is necessary in public awareness, and the regional governance that combined with public awareness enables such massive expenditures to be undertaken. My hope would be that a planning authority, such as a metropolitan authority, that I experienced firsthand in London, the Greater London Council, which had regional planning responsibilities, but interacted with local boroughs, the equivalent of our diverse towns in the metropolitan Boston area. This kind of interlacing of bioregional urbanism and the wildlands and woodlands that the Harvard Forest people propose could really lead to very good results. It would be the interweaving, like an afghan, that is created by different strands of wool, in itself is attractive, but is also fairly solid. I am not going to confuse us more by trying to go to a Google map and point out that obstacles that the retreat would bring with it, namely, where do we retreat to in the uplands? Roxbury and portions of Blue Hill Avenue are an option. It's already higher and safe from sea level rise. Further afield, Lexington, Concord, Brookline, maybe Worcester, maybe Framingham. All of those are already well-established communities, and they wouldn't strongly resist, I predict, any major influx of institutions and populations that are fleeing the shorelines. So this would require quite a bit of careful thought and careful planning to undertake such migrations. In any case, keep dirt in mind. It's appropriate, it is nature related, and it spells out how we should think about doing things. Each of you who are listening today will need to make your own judgment about the wisdom of either pursuing the idea of a retreat or to undertake the massive structure of a 14-mile-long dam to protect all of metropolitan Boston and the metropolitan Boston engine. Each of you will have a voice in this, in the public forum. Each of you can augment this brief introduction to the topic by lending your voice, your insight, your illustrations of the obstacles, and perhaps suggestions for overcoming those obstacles. But in any case, keep dirt in the background of your mind. Either way, do it right. Don't just haphazardly stuff things onto the 14-mile-long barrier or into the communities to which you plan a wholesale emigration from the greater Metro Boston area. So do it right, do it well. Think about protection as one of the two alternatives. Retreat elegantly or protect well. And with that, we'll open up to questions. Esther, do you have any questions that arose? Maybe Esther has. Yes, Richard, you unmute yourself.
I wonder where you're going to get all this material to build this green dike.
That's a very good question. And the easy answer would be, oh, well, all the excavations from something like the Big Dig, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it's much, much more material. Besides, if we're going to make it resistant to storm surges, and particularly the impact of water, we'd have to go and create this from Roman concrete that does not erode with seawater infiltration. And Roman concrete, as I said, is a combination of volcanic ash and seawater. Well, that we have volcanoes and we'll have volcanic ash at the very least of Mount St. Helens, but getting it here, is a bit of a problem.
We have fly ash from power plants too.
I am not sure that that would qualify as the same chemical composition that in combination with seawater would create Roman concrete. It's a good idea.
I saw that Don Kinsvatter is on this call, and I'm wondering if he knows where the Big Digs dirt went to. I don't remember.
It went to Boston Island, Harbor Island, Spectacle
Oh,
Island.
that's right.
Yeah.
Spectacle Island.
Spectacle Island.
Yeah, I don't. Well, we could take re-excavate Spectacle.
There's a lot of shit down there.
Oh, yes.
Yes, Matthew.
Peter, hi. I wonder if you could talk about the sort of the potential economics of, you know, selling the residential condos out on this dike as sort of a money-making opportunity. That's kind of river, you know, bayside views and oceanside views would sell like hotcakes, wouldn't they? So I wonder if you could just talk a little about that.
Francisca and I did the calculations of a 200-foot wide top to such a dike, 14 miles long. And we figured at the current price of 5 million per something or other, I think per acre, the highest end real estate costs in Boston, we'd only raise about $1 billion or $2 billion, a long way from the 30 to 80 billion this would cost. We idealistically, we thought, oh yeah, we can go and get some private enterprise to finance this, such as the Back Bay was financed by private interests, but in fact, no, it's too paltry. And but by the same token, if you're going to find a way to use Roman concrete, you can expand into these green blogs in this image and expand to a larger area. We're not at all addressing with this concept the ecological implications and the resistance we would rightly get from people who are concerned about human intervention in natural ecology. But this is a trade-off that would have to be made. And the question is, can that be sold? We are in a different sociocultural era, evolutionary era, from the thoughts that existed in the mid 19th century that enabled a massive undertaking like the filling of the Back Bay by a combination of private and public enterprise. Yeah, Richard? Wait, I gotta unmute you.
I did it.
Okay.
Two related questions. One is sort of on the limited sort of question. That is, why not make the line straight rather than curved? Because it'd be a lot less expensive. And the second one is, why not go across from Winthrop over to Hull, where it should make a much, much, much smaller amount of construction required?
Well, from Winthrop to Hull would allow sea level to go and circumvent and invade the low-lying areas via Revere and Lynn.
I see.
Right? You really need to find some shoulder area which is as high as the dike in its own right.
And why not a straight line?
Why not a straight line? An initial instinctive feeling that a convex shape like this is more likely to resist the impacts of heavy seas. It's a guess. And it's arguable, you know. One would need to model this. We even thought of showing this as a bunch of little protrusions like prongs that go out there to diffuse the effect of the seas and the waves. But frankly, you don't have to really model that and see whether this is a harebrained idea or not.
And
Peter,
Peter,
yep.
there are some more questions. One from David. The seawater will need to go somewhere. What would be the consequences to communities north and south of the dike?
Good question. They would go swimming in fresh water. Like, you know, what benefits do they have? They have fishing benefits and they have recreational benefits right now. The fishing would change. It would still be water perhaps, but the ecology would change dramatically, predictably. And the tourist industry would be affected slightly, but not, I don't think, excessively. If you look at, if you think about this concept of a dike and I'm going to go back to that image I had over here. This one here, the dike, a freshwater lake inland, and the sea held off from the outside. It's you can imagine that stormwater reservoir on the at one point or another would begin to fill more and more of this reservoir, and therefore approach the same consequence or have the same consequences as rising sea level. You don't want that. So some form of pumping system would have to be installed to drain at some point the rising water level of the freshwater lake and pump it out into the sea. Good question.
Right, and actually, that I think that's a good answer too, because you also answer other related questions in terms of how the ecology ecosystem would be changed, disturbed because of the dike along the harbor. And one more questions is about is the dikes proposal based on the current climate change situation?
No, it would already. This was already planned for up to 2100.
Okay.
If there is a massive sea level rise of 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet due to global warming and the melting of the Greenland ice cap and the Antarctica, we're in a completely new ballpark, a new situation. So the very ecology of the seas at those points would change. And it's one of the questions that would have to be analyzed if we were to go and be rulers of the universe, and that this team of listeners were to get together and start brainstorming what can happen in each one of these scenarios. We would have to go and explore the ideas. But one thing that I am reminded of as I read New Scientists about the retrovirus effect, etc., none of these stories or predictions are tree-shaped. We are not heading into a branching of trees. We may be heading into something which starts branching and then retreats and takes another route. So any planning that we would be bold enough to undertake here, such as what might happen with a 5-foot sea level rise, and the ecology of the sea itself, the broader ecology, what would that portend? These are questions we can only answer in terms of how would our inheritors act comprehensively, politically, and undertake steps that under present circumstances would be thought of as anathema in order to achieve some goals that would communally be deemed appropriate. As you can see, I'm trying to choose my words very carefully because both present day considerations and future ideas would play an incredibly important role in whatever decisions are reached communally. And you know how communal decisions resemble the committee that is charged to design a horse, and the end result is a camel. Yes, Beth?
Another question. I'm fascinated, as you know, by the dike barrier concept, but I wanted to come back to the other option that you described, this kind of retreating option, and been thinking more about that and thinking about, like, do we have sort of examples from our history that where, for example, I don't know, the Roman Empire or some time in between, where a large metropolitan community was faced with this choice whether to abandon, cut stakes and leave, or to devote more resources, more investment into protecting against something. And it seems like we would, I'm not a historian, but it seems like we should be able to learn from some of those examples from our past. And I was thinking specifically about your comment about that these communities outside of Boston would not welcome us with welcome arms. And I wondered if maybe there are some communities that would. For example, a community that was kind of economically distressed otherwise. I think about the prize that went to build the Amazon headquarters a couple years ago, and all these communities around the country that were vetting to get that prize, and where they really wanted that massive development. Anyway, I wondered if you comment on either of those, the history or the this idea that a community might welcome a whole new development in a.
I'm gonna identify you as a member of the Harvard Forest and the kind of large-scale thinking that you guys do with David Foster, and that's why this kind of question is so relevant. I don't know, other than wholesale destruction and perhaps a few survivors from Santorini, Thera, and from Crete in that period. Crete itself was basically devastated by the tsunami that arose from the explosion of Santorini. I can't think of any others. If any of the other members of this audience have any examples, please chip in.
I think that you'd find plenty of them in Mesopotamia. The history books talk about Mesopotamia as a dry, barren oasis that was brought, well, a dry, barren, it was brought to agriculture by irrigation. But apparently 6,000 years ago, the land level was about 15 or more feet lower than it is today, and it was actually all a swamp. So the history is not at all clear. There are various archaeologists that have certain interpretations of it. I don't think that answer is defined. But there has been a lot of movement of shorelines and land areas where they continued to build up walls to try to protect themselves, but it didn't work. And so I think that there's a bunch of stuff in there. And of course, Rome was built and then Rome deteriorated. It was down to a population of literally a few hundred in about the 4th or 5th century. So there have been large numbers of examples of cities and areas that have risen and fallen. Part of it ecological, part of it military, part of it political. One of the proponents says that agriculture was what was forced on serfs who didn't have a better option. They lived out in the swamps because they could support themselves very readily in a water paradise. They had access to dry areas they could plant. They had access to fish. They had access to all sorts of things. And they were outside of the state. So they avoided being compelled to serve as serfs there. I think there's plenty of examples if you wanted to start searching for them.
Also, if you are interested, there was a lecture and a seminar of more or less this title, The R Word, a couple of years ago, and it spoke about the Louisiana community of Saint something or other that was given the choice, because they were noticing the encroaching sea levels on their homes, was given the choice to move to a part of Louisiana which was higher up, and there was financing in place to the tune of some 38 million, and they collectively decided not to go because they were not sufficiently involved in the planning process for that move and for the financing. They felt this was government imposed. So here's a lesson for us eggheads, and that we essentially represent. We think about these things and we talk in hopefully carefully modulated tones about the damn issues, but unless we take the time to engage the people who are directly involved, both sides in the case of Matt's question, how do we convince the people to move, and how do we convince the recipients of these emigres or immigrants to accept this? And it's a hugely complex issue, and it wouldn't occur. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council, I have been frustrated as all hell because it embodies the core of what would need to happen in order to have a cogent regional governance and the powers to direct planning in one way or another, which is mutually beneficial for the region as well as for the local community. Without that, it's basically a pissing contest between people who have opinions, but not necessarily a lot of information. Peter, you've said nothing. I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I'm just fascinated. This is new to me. So I'd heard rumors, but I didn't know exactly what you were focusing on.
Okay, all right.
Peter?
Well, did you get dragooned into listening? I hope it wasn't a total waste of your time.
So Peter?
Yep.
Richard here.
Yep.
Two questions. There's one in the chat about how would Swampscott and Cohasset not be inundated? And I had my own question which is, had you looked into whether to avoid impacts like that and to lessen other impacts, just to let the water in, to have this dike function to change the level of the water only when there are storm surges, when there are, so that, in other words, would that be significant enough to protect the city?
Oh, yeah. Because essentially what that idea postulates is that both sea level rise, in this image, sea level rise to 2017 and 2100 are indicated in this little diagram, and storm surges are shown. Well, storm surges, if you let the water in, the take of this area, let me just see, you can have a tremendous amount of storm surge occur, which is pressure related for the water. So you have a vacuum created for the sea, and you force both the sea as well as this reservoir to increase in height, and the storm will affect these areas in here. So that's the idea, to really protect against that. And Swampscott, I don't think has any low-lying areas. To the other part of your question, I don't think has any low-lying areas which would be inundated by the sea circumventing this barrier. That's why a wall between Winthrop and Hull would not do anything, because sea would inundate via Nantasket Beach or via Lynn and Revere, as the question arose earlier. You need something that is already a natural part of that barrier without having to recreate a barrier all the way up to Marblehead or further. Yes, Peter, Christopher.
Peter, have you looked at more natural versions of your barrier? I mean, I'm thinking along the coast, and I've had one thought, and I don't have any real data to support it. But that is, if you had a wide area of land, which of course we don't, along a coast, and that was available to grazing herds. In the west, it was buffalo. That land between the grasses and the buffalo raises at some, very small amount, but I think it approaches something like 1/10 of an inch a year. And if you had free range to grazing herds and very solid, I mean, we're talking deep rooted, big, I'm going blank, various rooted prairie grasses, it would be a fairly solid barrier, and it would grow itself. We don't need it to be 5 feet high now. We need it to be 5 feet high somewhere in the distance. And of course, we are dealing with surges that would tend to go over it. So that is only one piece of mangrove swamps, and basically allowing the water in bits and pieces with vegetation, collecting it in ponds, reed beds and such that will help absorb it. I think that it's a very complicated solution to a biological address to sea level rise. But it's all stuff that could be seeded and then would grow itself to a great extent. I mean, obviously it needs to be protected. Obviously it needs to be to work out more details. But
let me give you the example of the Mississippi estuary. Large areas of swamplands, mangroves,
yep,
etc. And what do you get? With a storm surge, you get flooding all the way over, and you get Katrina-like storms that inundate all of Louisiana. We have to think in terms of unbelievable quantities of water that come in under sea level rise and storm surges. And no mangrove area or anything will protect it. When you have a hurricane coming in Mississippi, you are flooded for a while. It recedes, yes, but that's you have a completely different human ecology.
I need you.
No, you cannot have.
I need you.
I am in the process of giving a lecture.
I need you.
You cannot have me now. Go to, excuse me for a second, please. I have to mute myself. I am very sorry.
Thank you.
Doing this from home leads to occasional interruptions, and I'm sorry. The idea of having some sort of intermittent absorption and so on. Yes, tsunamis have created havoc in all over the world, and after the floods recede in Hawaii or in Japan or in the Mississippi Delta, life goes on. But the life that has been created has experienced this over long periods of time. We are now talking of something that is like Louisiana, not Louisiana, Narlands. Like Narlands is man-made, human-made, and extremely vulnerable because it does not adapt easily to huge storm surges. The critical thing is to think in terms of orders of magnitude. Sea level rise of 5 feet over any stretch of time, 14 miles, for example, the amount of water that has to be defended against is enormous, something that we have no gut feeling for. And it cannot be absorbed if it is meant to protect the greater metropolitan area.
Peter, I'm wondering if part of this is thinking about what we're actually trying to do, or
Sure.
what we're capable of doing.
Mhm.
A little Grook favorite of mine says, the only defense that is more than pretense is to act on the fact that there is no defense. That wasn't written in terms of ecology. But I wonder if we've had an illusion that we can conquer nature and we can do anything we want and we can protect all of this stuff that we've built. And maybe that's one of the things that has to change. And not saying that we're giving up, I'm saying that we think about it differently. And we can do some reasonable things that make a lot of improvements. No, they won't solve it if you have a severe storm surge situation and there's going to be some flooding. But if we have to do 20 times as much in order to avoid that, 5% chance or whatever the heck the figures turn out to be, maybe there's a way to rethink something that will work most of the time and address what would happen in the times it doesn't, is being different from saying, let's build a wall that will protect it, period, all the time. Maybe there's an intermittent intermingling of allowing water in, addressing it with natural causes, and no, it won't solve everything, but it will solve a lot of it. And maybe there are actually some advantages in some of the things we could do that way. I haven't looked at your details very much, so I know you've looked at more than I have.
I have thought about this in terms of Boston and Cambridge. And specifically, I don't have in here, although it might have been in the TEDx presentation, an image taken from the, I believe it may have been the Avalon Apartments near the Prudential Center looking north, with flooding of the Back Bay and flooding of most of Cambridge. What I'm talking about is, let's assume that there is a storm surge in the very near future, which floods all of these areas and floods all the basements in the Back Bay and in Cambridge. How are you going to deal with that on a not once in 100-year basis, but on a more intermittent basis? That's the practical answer to your question. It is, I've tried to think of some sort of resilience for the properties in the Back Bay where I live. But quite frankly, when you have 2 or 3 incidents of flooding all the basements of the Back Bay, because you cannot avoid, it's not just superficial flooding, it is all the basements that get inundated when the local alleys are flooded, and the manholes allow the water to come in, and many of those basements do not have a backflow preventer. So you have the water level coming in through the basement and making the entire set of basements useless. Now that's certainly going to be affect large parts of the Boston business section as well. So it's I hear the wish for a moderate adaptability given our current structure, but I cannot, as an architect and planner, I cannot conceive of it in a realistic way.
Have you figured out a time frame for building this barrier? How long would it take if we said, you've got the money, let's start production tomorrow? I mean, I assume we're talking 20 years or so, or whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Have you figured that what the construction project would actually entail?
No. Not more than just simply saying it'll take a couple of decades.
Well, if it will take a couple of decades, it's not going to solve anything for the couple of decades until it's finished. So we still have.
It can. You don't have to go and build it up to the full height. So if you are careful and protect against a 2-level sea rise and the accompanying storm surge, you might be able to deal with it. Look, I am postulating a hypothetical but radical protection concept. It may be unrealistic for a whole bunch of reasons, cost being the least of them. Ecologically, it's there, and otherwise it's also unrealistic because the time it will take to fill up to sea level for that barrier, because that's going to be the majority of the barrier. It's going to have something small sticking out above sea level. You know, that's going to take a huge amount of time. And as Richard asked, where are we going to get the material from? You know, I don't know. So maybe this is all harebrained, and you can call it the Papesh scheme and be done with it. But
Peter,
yep.
just apologize to interrupt. I think it's a great topic opener that get everyone engaged, and you have been getting a lot of questions. I think it's making this meeting really successful. And so I do actually have another question from
Yep.
Bennett. So let's talk about a little bit of relocation.
Okay.
Do we have anything to learn from the other case, like the relocation of the capital of Brazil from Rio de to Brasilia? It doesn't have to be Brazil, I guess. But,
Yeah.
any other case that we can look into as a relocation that we might be able to draw and learn from?
Excellent question. But that requires top-down government making the decision. And the only government that's capable of doing that sort of thing right now is China, as far as I know. But any autocratic government could decide to relocate its capital. I'm wrong. I believe there is talk in Bangladesh of relocating the capital and maybe somewhere in Indonesia. I have vague memories of this kind of conversation. In other words, simply saying, look, this is silly. We can't go and fend off sea level rise. It's more, in those instances, it's more imminent than ours, perhaps. And they say, let's relocate. But that's across the entire population decision. And we don't have the kind of government or the kind of popular culture that would allow for such a draconian relocation. We just don't. We can't even create a metropolitan government here. So this would be, at the very least, at the metropolitan government level, that has powers, but powers beyond the typical eminent domain powers that were part of the past, that could say, okay, I'm going to go and let's take the Harvard Forest. All right. All right. We're going to go and come in, say, we need this entire space that you have husbanded for so long. We're going to go and build a new state government center. Good luck. You know, I'd be on the barricades with Matt and David. So, but you can see the issues that there is talk of a uniform decision. Just think about talking to Mayor Walsh before he leaves and say, you have good relations with the unions. You can go and promise them lots of construction work and related work in this new area. Why don't you vie for the powers to relocate? Because you can see imminent doom. Go back to that diagram, the fragmentation of Boston.
Peter, I've written to Mayor Walsh several times proposing a scheme like this, only going from Winthrop to Hull. So maybe he didn't pay any attention because it wouldn't work because of the breaching areas at the shoulders.
Well, Mayor Walsh has some very good sides to him and has shown his effectiveness. And at other times, he has simply ignored things that are longer ranging beyond what his current election term dictates. The wonderful attempt to create the Metro Mayors Alliance was a step in that direction, sponsored by the MAPC, but nothing much has come of it. And we have no uniform government that can implement any of these things. I think this dike concept.
Well, Peter, you shouldn't be so negative about it, because I think you don't get a metropolitan government until you have an obvious, what do you call it, a strong need to have one. So
Yeah.
a project like this would, it would generate its own need.
Maybe.
And Peter,
Yep.
one more question from Douglas. He's wondering, could we talk about how Dutch, Finland, they address their water problem, because they reclaim into the ocean and rebuild, actually increase their territories and their land. A lot of their land was reclaimed from the ocean.
Yes.
Are there things that we can learn from them?
A good question, but that was under the assumption that there would be a steady level of sea, which you can go on. You can fill lands, but all the filled lands that Boston represents would be flooded by an increased sea level rise. So we are, in some respects, as many people have pointed out, Sasaki in particular, we would be going back to the shorelines of the 17th century with a substantial sea level rise. This fragmentation that you see on the screen right now somewhat resembles the shorelines of the 17th century. I don't have another image that shows that frontage, but all of this, the airport is filled land and would be gone, or wasn't there. This Boston, the highland of Boston, the Roxbury Neck would be here. Cambridge would be largely underwater, and the current areas that we see are thanks to a constant sea level with 9-foot tides, and no, more than that. In Boston, it is also, there's a 6-foot dam, and same thing on the Mystic River, which protects from the 9-foot tides, because the 9-foot tides used to go all the way up into Watertown. Watertown Square was inundated daily by sea level rises. So the answer to the question is simple. It is the same kind of question that Richard had. Where would all that material come from in order to combat a sea level rise of 5 feet? It's very important to think about different relevant forces and difference in scales. What is relevant at the scale of this image that you see right here, showing a large portion of the Boston estuary, and what is relevant at a micro scale or much smaller scale that we architects normally deal with? We can't think about this sort of thing, but it's important to think about it in terms of historical evolution and the climate change that is occurring around us. Esther, any more questions?
No, I think I I catch most of it. I
Good.
might have missed one or two, but I did send out a note for us people to bring up their questions if I miss their questions. So I think overall we cover that pretty well.
Yeah, look, I am most willing to go and continue this conversation in another session by having the thoughts that any of you come up with as a result of hearing this and saying, you know, you overlooked this, or we didn't touch it, the questions didn't address it. The question that I have skirted completely up to this point was not completely, but I urge you to go to Google World, click on the Boston area, keep on clicking until it shows up the area between Boston and Framingham, let's say, and you see a lot of green in there, and you think, okay, well, there's a lot of space for us to retreat to. But then go down and zoom in some more, and you'll see the pockmarked development that has occurred. Single family houses strewn all over the place. That gives you an idea of the practical reality that any bunch of emigres from sea level to become immigrants upland will face. It's a very, very tough problem, and is a planning problem. It's not something that architects could undertake individually. There would be incredible opportunities for architects to work, but they would be working after the planners do their homework and actually put into place some ideas and some proposals and get some political support for the idea of creating replacement for the individual communities and organizations or entire towns or cities. Think of the difficulty of starting over for Boston. We haven't got the land that Brasilia represented in the, oh God, I forgot his name, Niemeyer's time, the architect who planned Brasilia for the Brazilian government. You know, we don't have the opportunities, we don't have a political climate that allows for whole-scale introduction of a new city or a new capital. I don't wish to be completely negative because we're an ingenious species and we are a particularly creative profession. We were trained to go and dream and talk and think. When I was in grad school, we architects went over to the what's the dining room at the law school? Gropius Center, okay? And we were the only ones that talked more than the lawyers because, you know, full of ideas, full of things. And then eventually we got to the point where we're saying, okay, let's start talking and start drawing. That's where we are right now in this total conversation. We would have to start saying, let's make some basic assumptions and put something in front of people. In other words, dream in ways that can be understood by lay people, can be discussed, can be objected to by lay people, who then will gather with their neighbors to do what I proposed at the beginning in that TEDx talk. Somebody's going to have to start talking to neighbors to encourage them to think about relocating, and then how to do it, how to cut the roots, how to establish new roots, how to get a whole community to move. There is something that I can see happening once a movement starts. Others will get on that bandwagon. but you have to start that little trickle and then eventually turn up. Christopher.
I'm just wondering, I mean, we're talking about Boston, and there's certainly reasons to think about that. And your proposal for the barrier is about Boston. But the reality is, if we assume all of this is right, New York, to some extent, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all the way down the coast is going to have the same problem.
Worse.
Is there any point in thinking about it as an East Coast problem and finding out if there's similarities that give us some ideas about how to think about it that actually deal with the whole East Coast as opposed to just isolating it to one set of experiences? I mean, obviously Boston is different from New York or Philly or Baltimore or whatever, but I just wondered if there are themes that fit all of them that it would inform us about ideas.
Yes.
And then they have to be addressed, individually for the different circumstances, but understood in a much broader context.
Right. I could maybe chime in with my 2 cents here.
Of course. Yes,
thank you. There's been an ongoing ongoing movements. There's been people have been trying to reverse the clock, reverse the changes that's occurring to slow down the list, to slow down the sea level rising, and that's where 2030 has been taken place. 2030 is the green movements that the individuals and the companies, the professional as a whole could sign up for, and for all the little things that we do, like cut down embodied carbons, cut down operational carbons emissions, and achieve net zero positive, and use more renewable energies, reduce energy consumptions. All those are the things that we could do now to reverse. So if not reverse, at least slow down the climate change. And we still have time. We have very little time left. And but overall, if you look at the industry, there are a lot of companies and firms that they are trying to make a difference with every project that they build, the material that they choose to use to make the built environment more sustainable. So we won't be stuck with the rise of sea level so drastically. We had to make changes that the impact are so tremendous that we can maybe somehow live peacefully with the nature.
Esther, let me
yes.
jump in because really this we are now talking of 2 different scales.
Yes.
Our effect of our profession and the entire construction industry on climate change is relatively minimal but significant. Okay, it's very small. The real challenge would be to try and reverse climate change, which is at a scale that is worldwide, and we have no good way of thinking about that as architects. It would require geoengineering of a scale to draw the CO2 out of the air and out of the atmosphere in order to go and reverse climate change. So that's one. The second point that I want to pick up on is the East Coast wide, or actually national wide issue that Christopher brought up, study of solutions or options. And indeed, you have hit the nail on the head. Boston is unique in its having a couple of shoulder areas which could be linked, but many other places like New York is not. I mean, you have a number of studies that have been undertaken, and it's probably worth a PhD to somebody who goes and just collects the studies that have been carried out from Maine down to Florida, to Miami, and up the Gulf Coast, and then skip over to the West Coast. There are, I'm sure, there are innumerable studies underway, and it would be very good to try and compile that information. It will surely inspire new ideas for not only amongst the areas that are studied, but perhaps jumping up to our New England coast and our Boston area. In any case, it's a very relevant question, and I don't have an answer for it. I know that a major study was undertaken by MIT to deal with the New Jersey flatlands and how to address flooding there. I just simply, that's beyond my ken, but it needs to be acknowledged. It's there. I think we are, sorry, Esther, you were gonna.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was just gonna say that we are at the time. We're gonna run over 1:30. We're gonna,
Yes,
yes.
I also noticed that right now. I think we've covered many of the highlights of the issues that we are facing, or that not only we, but others are facing. I am certainly willing to first of all, please feel free to email Esther and me, and we will go and collect these ideas and maybe create with some other people, some other experts, the questions and have them talk about them in the context of these two. Maybe there are more, but these two primary alternatives that we are facing: either retreat and make it an elegant retreat rather than a rout, or protect. With that, I think we can call it an end.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.